population to be enumerated in population censuses. The goal of a population census is to count every person once and only once at the place where they live. For many, perhaps the majority of people, this is a straightforward thing to do. But for an increasing number of people, this is not so simple. For example, there are people with more than one address, children who live part-time with divorced or separated parents, and those who have no fixed address, and people who do not wish to be counted. In the international context, it is very important that each person is counted as a resident in one country only, and should not be counted in 2 or more countries, or not counted anywhere. The 3 main ways in which a population may be defined and counted are present population count, service population count, usual resident population count. A present population count is the simplest form of counting populations. People are counted at their place of enumeration. Usually this is the dwelling where they spend the census night. So, foreign residents who are in the country even temporarily at the time of the census will be included, and usual residents of the country who are absent at the time will be excluded. A present population count removes complications associated with the idea of place of usual residence, and can reduce the incidence of double counting or missing people. A present population count can be used together with information on migration flows to produce an estimate for the national resident population of a country. However, data on migration flows is weak in almost every country, and residents who are temporarily outside the country at the time of the census may be missed. In addition, this approach may not provide an accurate geographic distribution of usual residents for effective planning and policy purposes. Another population definition that may meet a country's need is the service population count. Types of service population count include daytime populations, working populations, and visitor populations. In some countries, there may also be an interest in foreign service populations, consisting of persons residing abroad who cross the border regularly to provide or consume services. This is particularly important in the planning and provision of transport. A service population count may be required if the normal population count does not accurately represent the demand for or provision of services in a country or part of a country. Service populations are relevant where a significant proportion of the population providing or using services in an area are not usual residents of that area. A usual resident population count is a count of all usual residents of a country at the time of the census. The purpose of counting the usual resident population instead of the present population is to have a better set of information for planning and policy purposes on the number and characteristics of people and households who actually live in a place or country, rather than including people who are only present at the time of the census. Because many countries adopt the usual residence approach, we will explore the concept of usual residence in more detail. It is important to remember that different concepts of usual residence can and are adopted. Countries can apply any definition that best suits their internal needs. However, it is also important to have common definitions for international comparisons and to compile population counts across different countries. The usual resident population is based on the idea that each person should have one and only one place of usual residence. The purpose behind this concept of usual residence is to collect information on the numbers and characteristics of people associated with the place where they actually live, rather than where they may have been at the time of the census. Unfortunately, it is becoming increasingly difficult to understand and define a person's usual residence. For example, members of the household may move across borders to work while maintaining a residence in another country. Within a country, people may maintain multiple residences for economic and other reasons. Young children may share living arrangements with separated or divorced parents, and school-aged children may live away from their parents. A major issue is how to define the place of usual residence for people who change their place of living, especially those who do so frequently. It is important to put a threshold to define the minimum time a person needs to live in a place to be considered as usual resident. A time period as such helps to understand what type of population we are counting. All countries that adopt the concept of usual residence make reference to a time threshold: 3, 6, or 12 months. Each country may have different views on how long the threshold should be. This depends on the purposes for which the statistics are to be used. Short thresholds and long thresholds both have advantages and disadvantages. Shorter thresholds, such as 3 or 6 months, include people who are moving for short periods, as usually resident. Longer thresholds, say 12 months, consider people who are out of the country for shorter periods as usual residents. When defining people's place of usual residence, one can also take into account their intentions. The objective of this is to consider where people expect to stay after the census, in addition to the place where they actually stayed before the census. This concept is particularly important in the issue of how to count temporarily present or absent persons, which will be discussed later. While the time threshold is a quantitative measure, it is certainly subject to error. People can have difficulties to accurately understand how long they have lived in certain places. However, intention by nature is subjective and more prone to error. In view of the 2010 censuses, the Conference of European Statisticians agreed that for international comparability, the census population count should be based on the concept of usual residence with the 12 months threshold. More precisely, only those persons who have lived in their place of usual residence for a continuous period of at least 12 months before census day, or who have arrived in their place of usual residence during the 12 months before the census day, with the intention of staying there for at least 1 year, should be considered as usual residents. Children born in the previous 12 months should be included. Countries are free to apply any definition that suits their purposes internally, and indeed some countries use different periods, such as 6 months. However, it is important for international comparisons that they are able to compile population figures using the internationally agreed definition based on the 12 months threshold, to ensure that people are consistently counted across countries and are only counted in one country. For the vast majority of people, this definition is straightforward. However, for people who move frequently, this may be difficult. We will now look at some of these movers and make some comments on how to deal with their situation. People who work away during the week and then return to their family home at the weekend should consider the family home as their place of usual residence. It doesn't matter if the workplace is in another country. This should not cause major difficulties, as most persons in this situation would consider the family home as their place of usual residence. For those primary and secondary students who live away from home during the school term, Their home and not their place of study is their usual residence. In the case of third-level students studying at college or university, their term time address is the place of usual residence. Some countries consider the family home the place of usual residence. The treatment of third-level students is not without controversy. Parents often list a child's usual residence as the household home rather than a college or university, because they see the college as temporary. However, for determining the impact on local services and conditions, it may be important to list students at the college or university. This can often result in double counting. While it is important to be clear about the rules for usual residence, this is one of the most difficult areas to maintain accuracy and consistency. People who regularly live in more than one residence during the year should be counted in the place where they spend the most time, irrespective of whether it is abroad or not. If a child alternates between two households, as is often the case for children of divorced or separated parents, then the household where they spend the most time is the place of usual residence. If there is an equal amount of time spent between both parents, then they should be counted at the household where they are on the census night. Homeless persons, roofless persons, nomads and vagrants are frequent movers without a regular place of residence. Therefore, for these people, the concept of usual residence does not readily apply. In these cases, the place of enumeration at the time of the census should be counted as the place of usual residence. Persons who are usually resident in the enumeration place, but are absent or expected to be absent at the time of the census for less than 1 year, should be considered as temporarily absent persons, and thus included in the total usually resident population. On the other hand, those persons who are living in the enumeration place at the time of the census, but are expected to be present for less than 12 months, are considered temporarily present persons, and therefore should not be counted in the total usual resident population. To enable different population counts to be compiled, separate information should be collected for each household and for each person within a household concerning 1. Persons usually resident and present at the time of the census. 2. Persons usually resident but temporarily absent at the time of the census. 3. Persons temporarily present at the time of the census but usually resident elsewhere. To obtain the total population of a country or a region of a country, it is necessary to add together persons who are usually resident and present, and persons who are usually resident but temporarily absent. The total usual resident population should include all persons who are usually resident irrespective of their legal status. This means that illegal, irregular, or undocumented migrants should be subject to the same rules as everyone else. This also applies to travelling asylum seekers and persons who have applied for and have been granted refugee status. In the case of military and diplomatic personnel and their families located outside the home country, they should be counted as part of the total usual resident population of their home country. Equally, foreign military, naval and diplomatic personnel temporarily located in a country should not be counted as part of the total usual resident population. Some countries choose to keep separate counts of these groups. As we have seen, one of the most difficult and enduring problems in conducting a census is defining and obtaining consistent and accurate information on where a person lives. Deciding on the rules is just the first step. It is critical that census forms, especially when they are to be completed by the respondents, are clear as to what the rules are on the place of usual residence. Finally, enumerators must be well trained when they are the ones filling out the forms. However, even if all this is done, problems with consistency and accuracy remain. There are two reasons for this. The first is the difficulty people have in understanding the rules. The second is a reluctance or refusal by some people to follow the rules for defining usual residence. For example, in some countries, college-age students are to be counted at their school. Some parents do not agree with this and will include them at home, which may result in double counting. Double counting is one of the biggest problems in the census for many countries. Some suggestions have been offered to try to deal with these problems. Improvements in algorithms to detect possible cases of double counting and improvements in technology, such as handheld devices, will ease but not eliminate this problem. In another approach, the person or enumerator is not tasked with deciding on the place of usual residence. Instead, a series of questions are asked concerning current and other residences, time spent in these residences, places of employment, voting, and the sharing of children. An algorithm is used to make the final determination based on the answers. This approach has some obvious problems, such as the additional burden on the respondent and the accuracy of the algorithm. Approaches such as this show promise, but to date no alternative exists to setting rules for the definition of usual residence and asking people and/or enumerators to make a decision on usual residence. The international recommendations provide common definitions that, if adopted, allow comparability of census results across countries. If countries do not follow the international recommendations on usual residence, for instance with regard to the length of stay or the place where college students should be counted, the results will be affected, and an additional burden will be placed on them to make the results comparable with other countries.